Are you ready to witness the moment when our lone bounty hunter turned reluctant hero storms into the most opulent restaurant in New Shanghai, only to find an alien girl bound for slaughter as the evening's specialty dish? This electrifying confrontation is the heartbeat of our story, setting off a chain reaction of danger, empathy, and desperate escapes. If you want to know how this pulse-pounding conflict unfolds, stick around until the very end. We promise you won't regret it. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing exciting, mind-bending tales like this one. With your subscription, you'll stay updated whenever we publish more thrilling adventures filled with unexpected twists and heart-stopping moments. Get comfortable, suspend your disbelief, and join us as we follow our unlikely pair on a perilous journey that challenges the boundaries of morality and the meaning of true heroism. Rowan Drake sat alone at a circular table in the gilded heart of the Grand Horizon, New Shanghai's most exclusive floating restaurant. The swirling lights overhead shattered refracted glimmers across the polished black marble floors, and from his vantage point near the arched floor-to-ceiling windows, Rowan watched the entire city unfold below in neon brilliance. Hover cars whisked through the towering arcologies, their engine hums swallowed by distance. Within the Grand Horizon, voices melded into a polyglot murmur in at least a dozen languages, from earthborn tongues to off-world dialects, creating an undertone of cosmopolitan grandeur. The restaurant's antique chandeliers, suspended by anti-grav couplings, refracted the rainbow hues that emanated from the hovering menu screens at each table. Patron after patron sipped luminous beverages brought by graceful servo drones, each vessel costing more than what many workers in the under-level factories would earn in a month. Rowan lifted his crystal whiskey glass and traced its rim absently. The amber liquid caught the prismatic overhead lights, and for a moment, he stared into the refracted glow as though searching for a lost memory. 5 years ago, before he had become a fixture in New Shanghai's high society, Rowan might have been scanning every exit route, calculating the best vantage points for a quick getaway. But now, he told himself, that was all behind him. He'd spent years distancing himself from his past. The new life he had built here, one of lonely luxury, felt artificial yet comfortably numb. Despite the veneer of privilege, he sensed there was a hollowness deep inside, a sense of moral displacement that never quite went away. A figure in a sleek black suit approached, footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. Yilun Li, the maitre d', was refined to perfection. Trim beard, hair groomed meticulously, posture as upright as a ceremonial guard. "Another Martian single malt, Mr. Drake?" he asked, his voice carefully modulated to exude calm professionalism. Over the years, Lee had shown no change in demeanor. He was as polite and formal now as the day Rowan first stepped through these doors. Perhaps it was part of the training. Never get too close, never pry, yet always remain indispensable. "Yes, please," Rowan replied, inclining his head in a genteel nod. He glanced at the floating holographic menu that spun lazily above the table. As usual, the selections were beyond extravagant. Exotic cuts of alien flora and fauna were meticulously engineered to provide the rarest flavors in the system. Cost was no object for the wealthy denizens that filled the horizon each night, among whom Rowan now uncomfortably counted himself. From the ephemeral notes of Titan truffle to the intensely sweet glow shrimp from the Jovian moons, the menu read like a gastronomic voyage. Yet something darker gleamed below the surface of those lines, some shadow of cruelty hidden behind artful language. He scrolled through the floating text with a few swipes of his augmented lens until his gaze paused at the chef's supreme rarity. It was the sort of dish only mentioned in hushed rumors, designed for the kind of client who thrived on exclusivity. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before pressing the order icon. Observing him closely, Yilun Li raised an eyebrow, discreetly impressed. "I will need to verify your credentials, Mr. Drake." Without a word, Rowan placed his thumb on a small silver scanner. Holographic script and numbers spiraled upward, confirming him as a legitimate purchaser, verifying his finances and certifications. It felt surreal. Once upon a time, Rowan had built an entire life on avoiding scans like these. Now, ironically, his systems were some of the best. Everything appears to be in order, Lee said at last, bowing slightly. The chef will begin preparations immediately. Rowan watched Lee glide away, his footsteps soft, refined, perfectly aligned with the restaurant's cultivated elegance. The gently turning city panorama outside drew Rowan's attention again, and from 100 stories above the street, he saw the bright arteries of traffic weaving through the neon labyrinth. Once upon a time, Rowan had navigated those busy avenues armed to the teeth, hunting targets beneath the haze of relentless rain. He recalled nights spent on precarious rooftops, scanning the alleys for marks he was paid to apprehend or, on darker occasions, eliminate. That was a different person, he reminded himself, a life he had abandoned. Lee's discreet staff soon arrived with another glass of Martian single malt, placing it with a quiet flourish. Rowan took a tentative sip, savoring the peaty smokiness that lingered on his tongue. A single malt this rare should have given him a sense of decadent triumph, yet all he felt was a slow, unsettling churn in his stomach. The soft hum of anti-grav wine bottles and whispering servo drones was reassuring to some, but to him, it seemed to echo the hollowness inside. Nearby, a group of diplomatic dignitaries from Europa engaged in animated conversation about mineral rights in the outer colonies. Beyond them, corporate luminaries from Luna haggled over mining futures while swirling gem-infused cocktails. The shimmering clothes, the status implants, the lavish gestures of wealth, it all felt as though each occupant of the restaurant was playing a part in a massive, carefully orchestrated performance, each table its own stage. Rowan had chosen to seat himself by the window to avoid the pomp, but he could still sense it pressing in on him. 45 minutes. That was how long it took for the chef's supreme rarity to be prepared, presumably with every specialized technique and flourish one could imagine. He nursed his drink, ordered another, then another, letting the minutes slip away in a haze of ambient chatter. Each subsequent sip slid down his throat more easily, a buffer against the creeping sensation that he was crossing a boundary he had never intended to approach. For a moment, the old reflexes flickered in his mind. Where are the emergency exits? How many armed guards does this place really employ? He sighed at himself. Old habits died hard. The restaurant's hush broke into a soft titter when a flambéed Jovian dessert arrived at the neighboring table, drawing audible gasps. A swirl of azure flame leaped into the air, dancing over the caramelized crust. Rowan watched impassively, an undercurrent of impatience gnawing at him. What in the world had he actually ordered? How far did these so-called delicacies go? He'd heard rumors, wild, improbable stories, about unorthodox dishes that skirted legality, but he'd always dismissed them as urban legends or press exaggerations. The hush extended around him as Lee glided back into view, accompanied by two servers guiding a large, glimmering dome on an anti-grav cart. People in the surrounding tables cast curious glances, half hoping to see something scandalous. Lee approached with that same impeccable composure, but there was a flicker in the maitre d's eyes, an unease perhaps, or maybe it was a slight fear. Standing upright, he offered Rowan a polite bow. "Your chef's supreme rarity, Mr. Drake." Slowly, ceremoniously, the two servers lifted the gleaming silver dome. At first, Rowan's bleary mind struggled to comprehend what lay beneath, but once the dome was raised, the sight knocked every trace of composure from him. His glass slid from his hand, shattering on the polished floor. Bound to the cart was a living being, a young woman with emerald green skin glimmering in the overhead light. Her wrists and ankles were encased in shimmering force restraints, and a gag pressed firmly against her mouth muffled any attempt she might make at speech. Even in panic, her gold-flecked eyes radiated intelligence and raw terror. Time seemed to grind to a halt. Every hair on Rowan's neck prickled. The restaurant's elaborate hum abruptly faded into white noise as he locked eyes with the captive. She was slim but muscular, her emerald complexion catching shards of crystal light from above. Her dark hair fell around her face in disheveled waves, and her parted lips behind the gag formed the silent plea. "Help me." Rowan's mind echoed that phrase, as if her emotions were flooding into his own. He felt an unexpected surge of adrenaline, as though an electric current had jolted him from a half-decade slumber. Yilun Lee cleared his throat, valiantly trying to maintain protocol. "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Drake?" The chef has assured me that she is prepared properly. The inflection in his voice suggested he knew exactly how wrong this situation was. Yet something in his stance, maybe training, maybe fear, forced him to continue. Rowan found his own voice trapped behind a knot of raw shock. What? He managed, feeling numb. What is this? Lee inclined his head apologetically. The highest level delicacy on our roster requires advanced certifications, the purchase of certain legal disclaimers, and exceptional payment. It's extremely rare, sir. With a trembling hand, Rowan braced himself against the edge of the table, half rising as he stared at the woman strapped down. Her eyes glistened, and he sensed an urgent flicker of thoughts. Could he feel her fear? It was like an echo in his mind, resonating from her. Something not quite telepathy, but close enough to send a fiery shock to his gut. She's an empath, Lee continued, keeping his tone low. It's widely believed that the neural tissues of her people can induce extraordinary flavor experiences when consumed. Indeed, many connoisseurs rave about the gastronomic nuances. We keep them sedated. She's quite docile. The color drained from Rowan's face. He was well versed in illicit dealings and had once moved in underworld circles that trafficked contraband from uncharted planets. But a living, sentient being, sold as a meal. He'd encountered some horrors during his past life as a bounty hunter, but this gutted him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The woman, with her radiant eyes and trembling limbs, was no delicacy. She was a person, bound, gagged, about to be butchered in a kitchen masquerading as a temple of haute cuisine. Beneath the table, Rowan's right hand twitched, an old reflex that preceded drawing a weapon, back in the days when he carried one. He no longer wore a conspicuous sidearm, but concealed within his luxurious coat was a small needle pistol, just enough to get out of a jam. Never had he imagined using it here, in the city's poshest restaurant. But logic had evaporated, replaced by the urgent compulsion. Get her out. I won't be eating that, Rowan muttered, his mind darting in 1,000 directions. The entire staff had begun to circle them like hawks. The hush at the nearby tables grew heavier. Shocked onlookers, half rising or pressing back in revulsion. A stolen empath? How was this allowed to happen here, in the so-called civilized echelons of New Shanghai? Lee's expression tightened. Mr. Drake, he said carefully, I'm afraid you've already paid. I'm sure you're aware that legally she is now your property. But Rowan's next action cut him off. His left hand deftly reached under the table to the holographic control that regulated the chandelier brightness. A second later, he wrenched the dial far beyond normal parameters, spiking the power. The overhead crystal shattered in a sudden shower of sparks, plunging the entire wing of the restaurant into near darkness. Cries erupted from the dining crowd. Metal shards clinked against the floor, and the emergency backup lights flickered, casting everything in a lurid red glow. Swiftly, old instincts roared back to life. The near darkness gave Rowan cover. He vaulted over the table before Lee could react, intercepting the maitre d' just as he went for a concealed pulse pistol. Years ago, Rowan had been outfitted with reflex augmentations, good ones, before he'd left that existence behind. Now they reasserted themselves with unstoppable force. He drove his elbow into Lee's jaw, hooking the man's wrist with his other hand so the pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. A sizzle of energy lanced overhead, singing the ornamental tapestries. Chaos swarmed through the Grand Horizon's main hall. Panicked guests screamed, toppling their chairs, stumbling over each other as they tried to flee. Security detail in formal suits began to converge on Rowan's position, blinking as they adjusted to the emergency lighting. Meanwhile, servo drones spun in wild confusion, colliding with each other above the disordered mass of elite diners. Glass shards from shattered lamps glinted underfoot. Through the swirling disarray, Rowan kept his focus on one goal: rescue the captive empath. When he looked back to the anti-grav cart, he saw two servers brandishing shock batons, forcibly tightening the restraints on the young woman. She struggled mightily, muffled cries audible despite the gag. In a single fluid motion, Rowan grabbed a toppled metal platter from the nearest table and hurled it at the servers. It wasn't a refined or graceful move, but it had enough force behind it to knock one assailant to the floor. The other whirled with the baton raised, But Rowan was already upon him, hooking an arm around his neck, slamming him onto the polished tiles. Frantic adrenaline pounded through Rowan's veins. He located the control panel on the cart that regulated the force restraints, each second crucial. He hammered the panel with the edge of his fist, sparks flying from the shorted circuit. Immediately, the humming glow around the empath's wrists and ankles dissipated. She slumped forward, half falling into Rowan's outstretched arms. Despite the swirling madness, he felt an odd, almost electric warmth radiating from her, her entire body trembling. He quickly removed the gag, and she coughed, her vibrant golden eyes wide with terror and gratitude. "We have to move," Rowan whispered. But before he could support her fully, an energy bolt scorched the floor next to them, blackening the polished marble. Glancing up, Rowan saw a trio of security officers at the entrance, brandishing high-grade pulse rifles. They took aim in unison. He shifted to shield the woman. If those security goons recognized him, it would only worsen things. "Stay behind me," he said. She nodded even as her ragged breathing made it clear she was half in shock. Rowan's mind blitzed through possible exits. One immediate route lay through the kitchen behind them. He pressed a small device at his belt, a personal flashbang. He squeezed his eyes shut just as a burst of light exploded, momentarily disorienting the armed officers. Grabbing the empath's hand, he sprinted for the kitchen. She kept pace better than he expected, adrenaline perhaps fueling her exhausted body. They burst through a set of swinging doors and into a pristine culinary laboratory, all stainless steel counters and sizzling induction plates. A half-dozen startled sous chefs and kitchen staff screamed or dropped utensils, diving for cover. Two of them, braver than the rest, grabbed knives from a cutting station and rushed forward. But Rowan's augmented reflexes kicked in again. He ducked, slammed a pan off the nearest staffer's wrist, and used a sweeping kick to topple the second. "Over there," he hissed to the empath, pointing to a door marked service elevator. "We can make it out to the parking levels." "Easier said than done," she managed, her voice rasping as she steadied herself. Rowan realized with a jolt that he still didn't know her name. But that question would have to wait. The alarm klaxons had kicked in full force now, piercing sirens that must have summoned more security from every corridor. He forced his neural augmentations to run quick scans of the environment, analyzing cover and threat vectors. The kitchen's overhead sprinklers had apparently activated from the flashbang's disruptive effect, drizzling water onto the polished floors. He pried open the elevator door, which was locked in emergency mode. Wires dangled from the control panel after Rowan yanked them free, bridging them with the tip of his needle pistol's microlaser. Sparks showered geared, and the door slid open with a groan. A volley of pulse shots tore through the metallic wall just inches from them, and he whipped around to return fire, carefully taking aim at the uniformed security emerging from the opposite corridor. His pistol spat silent needles of compressed energy. One guard crumpled, another stumbled behind a steel counter for cover. "Inside!" Rowan barked. The empath darted into the elevator, her wet hair clinging to her face as she hovered near the controls. He joined her, punching the button for the parking sublevels. With an excruciating slowness, the doors began to close, but not before another shot scorched the threshold, leaving a molten gouge in the metal. As the elevator descended in jolting starts, Rowan felt the first wave of pain from his injuries, some bruising along the ribs from the scuffle, a burning line on his upper arm where an energy bolt had grazed him. He glanced at the empath, noticing her arms trembling with a mix of shock and exhaustion. She looked up, meeting his gaze tentatively. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but undeniably vibrant. I thought it was the end." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet, lest the tightness in his throat reveal too much. Adrenaline still flooded him, making his thoughts sharper but also fueling a slow, foreboding dread. What he'd done was beyond reckless. He had attacked staff and security in the city's most prestigious establishment. And for what? A life, obviously, a life that had been about to be snuffed out for the twisted pleasure of the ultra-rich. Yet the ramifications loomed. The Grand Horizon was more than just a fancy restaurant. It was connected to networks of influence that spread through the top echelons of New Shanghai. They would not let this slide. At last, he extended his hand. "My name is Rowan Drake." She swallowed, nodding. "Alice, my name is Ellis," she said, voice trembling. Before she could say more, the elevator shuddered, then halted abruptly. The overhead lighting flickered. Rowan cursed under his breath. "They've jammed it," he muttered. Rapid footsteps in the shaft above suggested that security might be attempting to cut them off. Ellis's eyes went wide, and Rowan felt a faint echo of her fear rolling off her, like a wave he could almost tangibly sense. He pried open the elevator panel, scanning the mechanical systems. "We can't go any lower. We'll have to get out on foot." Above, footsteps clanged louder. He recognized the sound of professionals, probably a specialized retrieval team. He had to move quickly. Rowan tore away the small hatch in the elevator ceiling and peered into the dimly lit shaft. Elise backed away, eyeing the darkness warily. "Where does that lead?" she asked. "Maintenance ladder, if it's still functional." The overhead footsteps were louder now, and he could make out faint sparks showering as someone tried to breach the elevator door from above. He braced himself, hooking his arms through the hatch, then hoisted his body up. Straining, he reached down to help Elise climb atop the elevator car. Her green-tinged fingers slipped in his grip at first, but he steadied her with an iron hold. She found her footing on the metal surface, shuddering at the labyrinth of dark cables around them. "We have to climb down to sub-level 3, Rowan said, shining a small beam from his wrist device across the narrow gap. The maintenance ladder, a rusted, half-forgotten piece of infrastructure, ran along the concrete shaft. Exposed cables littered the path. "It's about 5 floors down. We move quickly and try not to fall." Ellis nodded, swallowing hard. "Lead the way." He grabbed the ladder and began descending, hearing Ellis follow suit. The clang of her shoes against the rungs echoed in the narrow space, every movement laced with tension. Somewhere above them, the hiss of a cutting torch signaled that the security team was forcibly slicing through the elevator's upper doorway. The entire compartment creaked ominously, vibrations running through the metal as sparks fell from overhead. Heart pounding, Rowan estimated they had maybe 90 seconds before their pursuers broke through. He glanced upward. The shaft was steeped in darkness, apart from the occasional flicker from his beam. Drops of sweat trickled from his hairline into his eyes, but he blinked them away, forcing calm. Ellis, for her part, was silent, but he could sense her determination as she matched his pace rung for rung. 1 floor down, 2. The sound of gear-laden footsteps scraping metal gave them away, and soon the glow of flashlights cut through the gloom. "They're right below us," a voice shouted from above, the echo strangely distorted in the shaft. Suddenly, a bright muzzle flash lit the shadows, and a pulse bolt ricocheted off the elevator wall. Rowan cursed, ducking behind the next rung. Another shot came, narrowly missing Alyssa's foot. She stifled a gasp, pressing herself closer to the ladder. Rowan inhaled sharply, scanning the area for any edge they could exploit. The sub-level hatch leading into the parking structures was still at least 2 floors down. With pursuers above, moving downward was their only option. But the security team seemed ready to pick them off from vantage points. Rowan's augmented eye, still partly functional, highlighted a secondary hatch a few meters to the right, likely another maintenance corridor. It wasn't on the main route, probably left from older expansions. If they could just reach that corridor, they might slip away. He turned to Alyssa, pitched his voice low so it wouldn't echo. "We have to jump across to that hatch. It's a bit of a leap, and we'll have to time it between shots." She looked at him with wide eyes, her expression one of stark terror warring with trust. "I'll follow you," she murmured. He nodded, tensing his muscles. Up above, the glow of flashlights intensified. They'd be in direct line of sight in seconds. "Now," Rowan hissed, and together they lunged, arms reaching for the opposite ledge, hearts pounding as another volley of pulse fire streaked past. Rowan's fingers scraped the rough edge of the hatch, and for a harrowing instant, he feared he might miss. But he managed to grip the corroded metal, clinging desperately. Ellis, leaping right behind him, nearly lost her hold. Her hand slipped, and she let out a strangled cry. Rowan pivoted, seizing her wrist at the last possible moment. Muscles straining, he hauled her closer until she could latch onto the hatch's rim with her other hand. The strobing flash of pulse fire lit the shaft behind them, and the acrid smell of scorched concrete drifted through the air. "Hang on," Rowan grunted. He kicked at the warped metal plate, forcing it to yield. A torrent of dust and rust flakes rained over them as the ancient hatch inched open. Overhead, he heard the clatter of boots. A volley of shots hammered the walls, sending sparks ricocheting across the narrow space. One pulse bolt grazed Rowan's calf, burning through his pants, and he clenched his teeth against the white-hot pain. Still, he and Ellis refused to let go. Summoning every ounce of strength, Rowan shoved the hatch wide, revealing a pitch-black crawl space. It was barely large enough to accommodate a person, but that was all they needed. He pulled himself inside first, then heaved Ellis in after him. They tumbled headlong onto the cold, grimy floor as the hatch clanged shut behind them, the space plunging into total darkness. Breathing hard, Rowan activated the dim beam from his wrist device again. The narrow corridors smelled of mildew and stale air, no doubt sealed off from proper ventilation for years. Ellis lay beside him, coughing. He could sense how close she'd come to plunging into the shaft. If he'd been just a second slower, no, he wouldn't dwell on that possibility. "Rowan," she said at last, her voice shaky, "I can feel their aggression. They're not going to give up. My abilities, they're weaker than they should be, but I can sense these people are determined to capture me again, or kill me if they must." Her golden eyes flashed in the dim light, searching his face for reassurance. He braced himself against the damp wall, letting his breath steady. "I'm not letting them take you." She nodded, and though her voice wavered, there was gratitude in her expression. In the hush of the cramped corridor, Rowan could almost feel an emotional undercurrent from Ellis, emanating comfort, fear, hope, all at once. He forced his mind back to the immediate problem. The next move. "We can't stay in here, they'll track us, and we're losing time." His augmented eye flickered, scanning the corridor layout. The old city blueprint he'd once memorized, back in his bounty hunting days, suggested that this sealed-off passage should connect to a subterranean service network. Perhaps from there they could access a safer route. "If we keep going this way, we might find a ladder or a hatch to an older sublevel. From there, I know someone who can help us," Rowan said. Ellie swallowed, wincing as she flexed her wrists, bruised from the restraints. Who could possibly help with this? Rowan gave a thin smile. "An old contact, a black market specialist who deals with weapons, intel, and questionable technologies." His voice dropped an octave. "Her name is Gia. If she's still around, she might have the resources for us to get off the grid, or at least figure out who exactly authorized you to be served for dinner." They locked eyes, sharing an unspoken pact. With no other choice, Rowan started crawling deeper into the darkness, leading Alice into the labyrinth of New Shanghai's abandoned underbelly, determined that no matter what horrors lay ahead, they would face them together. Navigating through a crumbling network of forgotten corridors, Rowan Drake led Alice by the hand until they reached a massive steel door recessed into the concrete. In an earlier, rougher era of his life, he had learned about these covert access points, back when he still carried a hunter's license and roamed the neon alleys for targets. He tapped a precise sequence onto a small digital pad set into the wall. After a tense second, the door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a warmly lit chamber within. Elise hovered at the threshold, wariness etched across her emerald features. The space beyond was a converted maintenance hub, fitted with reinforced walls, surveillance monitors, and weapon racks. The telltale signs of a seasoned operator's hideout. A tall figure with close-cropped black hair stood inside, surveying them with narrowed eyes of mismatched color. One a natural brown, the other a gleaming synthetic iris. She wore a sleeveless utility vest over a dark shirt, revealing cybernetic tattoos that ran the length of her arms. "Gia," Rowan said quietly, "it's been a long time." Gia exhaled a short laugh, though her posture remained tense. "Last I heard, you'd gone legit," she replied, lips curling in a half-smirk. "Thought you were rolling in upper-level wealth, trying to forget where you came from." She surveyed Elise with a cautious squint. "And you bring me an unregistered empath? The entire city's searching for you two. My scanners have been pinging security alerts nonstop." Rowan gave a quick, contrite shrug. "I know, we had nowhere else to turn. Ellis was about to be," he swallowed, "served as a meal. I couldn't let it happen." The flicker of revulsion that crossed Gia's face confirmed that she'd heard rumors of such atrocities. "So it's true," she muttered, moving closer. I've heard stories about empath trafficking, about unscrupulous culinary outfits and corporate labs. I never thought they'd be brazen enough to deliver a living person to a restaurant in public. When she turned toward Elise, the empath shrank back ever so slightly. Rowan realized that Elise could feel Gia's wariness rolling off her in waves. "I'm not here to harm you," Gia said in a softer tone, though it carried a hint of brusque directness. "But you both need a place to lay low, and if half the system wants her recaptured, you'll need more than a hiding spot. You'll need an exit strategy." Ellis's gaze flicked to Rowan. She still looked shaken. Who wouldn't be after her near brush with a grisly fate? "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. "I don't even know where to begin. My people have been disappearing for years. I was separated from my family and sold off." She paused, swallowing hard. "If there are others," Gia nodded and motioned them to a pair of utilitarian chairs near a med station. "Let me see those injuries." Without waiting for permission, she swept a handheld scanner over Rowan's bruised torso and Ellis's battered wrists. "You're both a mess." Rowan sank into a chair, finally allowing himself a moment of respite. "We need intel," he said grimly, every muscle aching. "Someone orchestrated the sale at that restaurant, and it must connect to a bigger operation." A ghost of empathy passed over Gia's angular face. "Bigger than you realize," she said. "We can talk about it once I make sure you're not about to keel over." She turned to rummage in a tall metal cabinet for bandages, painkillers, and a small kit of advanced medical tools. "Sit tight, this might sting." In a swirl of tension and relief, the door slid shut behind them, sealing out the labyrinth of corridors and the immediate pursuit. For now, they had a brief reprieve, and just maybe a shot at tearing into the conspiracy that had brought them here in the first place. Half an hour later, Rowan's bruised ribs had been tightly wrapped, and Ellis's abrasions were smeared with a healing salve that dulled the soreness. Gia had switched on a half-dozen holoscreens around the safe house, each one displaying a different vantage point in New Shanghai. Overhead traffic lanes, scanning frequencies, and undercity camera feeds. The glow from the screens cast shifting patterns of light across the concrete walls. "Your face is everywhere," Gia murmured, tapping on a feed that showed an official citywide bulletin with Rowan's portrait next to Ellis's. "They're calling you an armed and dangerous kidnapper who absconded with an extraterrestrial asset." She rolled her eyes. "Talk about spin. The restaurants must have big pull in the media networks to get this posted so fast." Ellis watched in silent horror. From the corner of his eye, Rowan could sense her trembling. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, feeling again that subtle echo of her emotions. Her mixture of rage, guilt, and a faint but growing resolve. "We didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "They would have—" "I know," Gia cut in, spooling through more data. "But there's more. My feeds picked up chatter from a group called the Vanguard Culinary Consortium. They're the ones funneling money into these top-tier establishments. Word is they have labs where they experiment on empaths and other exotic species to harvest neurochemicals." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "Elise, you're not the only one. The rumors suggest entire captive populations." Ellis's lips parted in shock. "Captive populations?" She stared at Rowan, eyes burning with indignation. "My people were always taught to hide. We knew humans considered empathic abilities valuable, but I never imagined." Her voice trailed off, cracking with emotion. Rowan rubbed his temples, the old tension headaches returning with a vengeance. Once, it might have been his job to hunt criminals. Now, ironically, he'd become a target for doing the right thing. "How do we expose them?" he asked, turning to Gia. "We can't just blow the lid off unless we have concrete evidence, something that the public can't ignore." Gia flicked through screens, her synthetic eye glinting. "The consortium is heavily protected, politically and militarily, but there's a rumored facility deep in the sublevels, something bigger than just a kitchen pipeline, a place where they do high-level research on empathic physiology." She paused, pulling up a faint blueprint that flickered with partial static. "If you get inside, you'll find records, test data, shipping logs. If we leak that, it could force a crackdown. But I don't need to tell you it'll be dangerous." "I'm in," Rowan said instantly, grim certainty in his tone. "We can't let them keep doing this." Ellis's gaze flicked from Gia to Rowan. Her voice shook, but her eyes held fierce determination. If there's a chance of rescuing others, any of my people who might still be alive, we have to try. Gia sighed, reaching for a battered data tablet. All right, but don't get yourselves killed. If you do manage to survive and secure the files, bring them back. I can distribute the intel to enough off-world channels that even the city's top brass won't be able to bury it. We'll blow this wide open. Before Rowan could respond, a series of shrill beeps cut through the safe house. The proximity alarms. Gia's jaw tightened. We've got company, she said, her voice dropping. Security teams, possibly consortium-hired contractors. They're right outside. Rowan and Alyssa exchanged a tense look. The momentary respite was over. It was time to fight again. An instant later, the overhead lights flickered from a comforting amber hue to a stark red alert. Weapon turrets emerged from the ceiling plates, pivoting with mechanical efficiency. Gia tossed Rowan a compact pulse pistol from a nearby rack. I'll hold them off as long as I can, she said firmly, tapping a command on her wrist console. You two take the secondary exit at the back. It'll lead into the old sewer expansions. It's not pleasant, but it should keep you off their main trackers. Rowan hesitated. Gia, we can— No time to argue, Gia snapped, stuffing extra ammo cells into his hands. Go. If I can stall them, they'll think you're still holed up here. Once you get clear, move on the intel facility. Disrupting them is your only real shot at staying free. Ellis laid a trembling hand on Gia's forearm. Thank you, she whispered, sincerity shining in her golden eyes. I don't know if you realize how many lives you might be saving by helping us. Gia's expression softened for a moment. Just live long enough to do some good with it, empath, she replied. Then her face hardened again. Now good to do. The door that sealed the hidden corridor hissed open at Gia's command. Rowan led Elis into the winding passage, the smell of stale air hitting them in a wave. Behind them, the safe house door crashed under the force of a breaching charge. They could hear shouts, the staccato of gunfire, and the high-pitched whir of Gia's automated turrets returning fire. Rowan forced himself not to look back. Gia knew what she was doing. She had built that safe house to withstand far more than a single squad. But the infiltration team wasn't standard corporate rent-a-cops. They moved with disciplined footsteps, used advanced tactics. Rowan's blood chilled as he recognized the signature clank of specialized armor. The consortium had mercenaries with real combat implants. The corridor shook under another explosion, and flakes of concrete drifted from the ceiling. Ellis flinched, pressing closer to Rowan, as if bracing for the entire tunnel to collapse. They hurried through the dimly lit passageway for what felt like an eternity. Rowan's personal HUD, linked to his neural augments, flickered with motion trackers detecting multiple squads searching the labyrinth. If they corner us down here, he said, voice tight, we're done. Ellis nodded, her breath labored. I can sense them. Anger, resolve, a hint of fear. They know you used to be someone who hunts. She cast Rowan a sidelong glance. They're expecting the worst from you. I'll give them a reason to fear, Rowan muttered, even as part of him recoiled from that old identity. We just need to stay one step ahead. At a junction in the corridor, they found rusted ladders leading downward into a deeper utility chamber. Through Elise's empathic sense and Rowan's tactical scans, they realized squads had blocked every route above ground. Down was their only option. They climbed, rung by rung, ignoring the stench that intensified with every step. The maintenance shaft opened into a large cistern-like room, dark water rippling across the floor. Faint glow strips along the walls flickered, revealing archaic pumps and pipes. Rowan's scan highlighted a battered service console across the chamber. If we can bring that console online, he said, we might redirect them or find an exit. A warning rumbled through the structure. Bootfalls echoed above, accompanied by the clank of weapons. Ellis's eyes widened. They're here. Rowan led her behind a massive pipe. Whatever chance they had to regroup and strike back might hinge on what he could improvise from the outdated console. He set his jaw, adrenaline spiking, and prepared to face the elite forces converging on them. A flash of bright light flared across the murky chamber as the first mercenary squad appeared at the shaft entrance, their weapon beams slicing through the stale air. Rowan ducked lower, pulling Ellis against the cool metal of the pipe. The old reflexes from his bounty hunter days surged to the surface. Even if he felt half lamed from the bruises and frantic flight, he still knew how to engage a superior force through subterfuge and timing. He set his pulse pistol on a crate beside him, carefully adjusting the beam intensity. With the other hand, he accessed the battered service console's panel, which flickered to life under his jury-rigged neural override. Lines of archaic code scrolled across the small screen, loaded with error messages. He gritted his teeth, trying to coax the system into manual override. Ellis closed her eyes, focusing. Though her empathic senses were still rattled by trauma, she could pick up faint emotional signatures. "They're splitting into two teams," she whispered. "One moving to flank us from the right, the other from the left." She pressed a hand to her temple, eyes squeezing shut in concentration. "I can try to disrupt them." Rowan spared her a swift glance. "You can do that?" "It's like sending a shockwave of raw emotion," she said hesitantly. "But it hurts me too, and I don't know if it'll hold them back for long." His heart twinged with worry for her. "Only if it's absolutely necessary," he said. Then he tapped at the console again, discovering an array of pump controls linked to the substructure. "We might have another way." With careful keystrokes, Rowan engaged the old pumps. The clang of ancient pipes reverberated across the chamber, rattling the walls as a surge of wastewater began filling the cistern's lower section at an alarming rate. If the mercenaries weren't cautious, they'd soon find themselves wading in chest-high water. The first few guards stepped off the ladder, scanning with bright beam lights that cut arcs across the gloom. They spotted the rising water, cursing loudly. Almost at once, they unleashed a barrage of plasma bolts toward the pipe Rowan and Ellis crouched behind. "Down," Rowan hissed, dragging Ellis into a prone position just as searing energy flashed overhead. The pipe shuddered under the impact, cracks forming in the rusted metal. Water rushed faster, swirling in a vortex around the floor's drains. Ellis's breath came in ragged gasps. "We can't stay pinned here." Rowan nodded, glancing at the console. The readouts indicated that the outflow valves, if triggered, might flush the entire chamber. That would force everyone, mercenaries included, toward a single exit. A risky gambit, but maybe it would give them a fighting chance. He slammed his palm onto the override. A groan echoed through the substructure. Suddenly, a torrent of water crashed in from multiple ducts. The mercenaries yelled, scrambling for higher ground. Chunks of debris, scrap metal, and swirling detritus bobbed in the roiling surge. "Go!" Rowan pulled Ellis with him, staying low in the swirling water. Shots rang out erratically as the mercenaries tried to maintain formation. Steam hissed from shorted electrical lines overhead, and an angry red glare of emergency lights pulsed through the mist. In the confusion, Rowan spotted a narrow corridor above the swirling waters, presumably a drainage route. If they could reach it, they might escape this death trap. Clutching Ellis's arm, Rowan made a mad dash against the chest-deep surge, each step a battle against the churning tide. Shots whizzed by, but luck or chaos spared them. They reached the corridor's entrance just as a final wave of water slammed across the chamber, pushing the mercenaries back. With one last heave, Rowan and Ellis hauled themselves inside, dripping and gasping, hearts hammering. For several moments, they simply lay on the damp floor, catching their breath. Somewhere behind them, the mercenaries were regrouping, but the rushing floodwater made immediate pursuit difficult. Ellis pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her frantic heartbeat. Rowan similarly grappled with the aftershock of close combat, his battered ribs protesting every movement. They rose unsteadily, leaning on each other for support. The corridor they had stumbled into was cramped, with rivulets of water still seeping in from the main cistern. Overhead, flickering orange lights illuminated a sign in Old Mandarin script, indicating this passage led to an even older sector of the Undercity. "Do we have a plan once we get out of here?" Ellis asked, her voice thin but resolute. Rowan nodded, though his mind spun with contingencies. "We need to reach that consortium research facility Gia mentioned. It's the only way to gather enough evidence to expose them. We'll have to go deeper into the underbelly and approach from below. That might let us bypass some of their external security." Elise visibly shuddered. Her empathy told her exactly what such a facility might contain. Her people, or others like her, trapped, experimented on, awaiting a fate worse than death. Then let's do it, she said, swallowing hard. I want to know just how far this conspiracy goes. Step by step, they navigated the corridor. At times, it sloped upward, at others downward, branching unpredictably. No official maps covered these depths. Expansions and infrastructure changes over the decades had rendered them a patchwork of sealed tunnels and half-finished expansions. Rowan used his neural augments to ping ancient data references, searching for possible ways to the surface or into heavily restricted sectors. Hours seemed to pass in an exhausting blur of half-lit tunnels and dripping pipes. Whenever they approached a region that might connect to the main thoroughfares, they encountered signs of heightened security patrols, automated gun turrets, scanning drones, or masked operatives. Each time they had to circle back, choosing increasingly convoluted routes. Finally, after an endless maze of concrete and steel, they reached a sealed hatchway that bore the insignia of the Vanguard Culinary Consortium, a stylized letter V entwined with a planet-like sphere. Rowan's augmented HUD flagged the door with multiple security protocols, biometric locks, code keys, potential booby traps. This looks promising, he muttered, slipping off a small bag he'd salvaged. Inside, Gia's emergency kit included a hacking device, a palm-sized tool with spidery leads that attached to security panels. Let's see if we can break in. While Rowan carefully wired the leads into the door's locking mechanism, Elise hovered, chewing her lower lip. I can sense minds inside, quite a few, anxious, resolute. They must be heavily armed or guarded. Rowan grunted acknowledgement. The hacking device whirred, lights blinking, as it attempted to brute force the lock. If we're lucky, the system we want is inside. We grab the data, find any survivors we can, and get out. The hacking device beeped. Then a click resonated through the hatch, followed by the glow of an emergency override. The door hissed open onto a dim corridor lit by eerie green overhead lights. Rowan and Ellis exchanged grim looks. This was it, into the belly of the beast. Rowan readied his pulse pistol, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ellis touched his shoulder, and for a moment he felt a wave of her focused determination wash over him. They stepped inside as quietly as possible, prepared to fight whatever nightmares lurked within. The corridor opened into a stark, sterile expanse, a laboratory complex from the look of the sealed glass rooms and banks of humming computers. The overhead lights buzzed, casting everything in a sickly, pallid glow. A chemical odor mingled with the metallic tang of recycled air, prickling Rowan's nostrils. He recognized the atmosphere of high-security labs all too well, controlled, cold, and indifferent to any suffering that might occur within. Elise kept close, her eyes darting nervously across each glass enclosure they passed. The first rooms appeared empty, rows of tables with clamps and drip feed lines, their surfaces stained with discolorations that made Rowan's stomach tighten. Perhaps the real horrors were deeper in, or perhaps everything had been moved in a hurry. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air felt, as if the facility itself clung to dark secrets. Rowan scanned with his neural augments, searching for a central data node or mainframe. Thanks to Gia's partial blueprint, he guessed it would be in one of the secure wings. But which? The place was bigger than he'd imagined, corridors branching in multiple directions, each lined with sealed labs or storage cells. From behind a reinforced door labeled specimen storage, muffled sounds emerged, something like mechanical humming mixed with low moans. Ellis froze, grimacing. I feel pain, she whispered. Desperation. It's faint, but it's there. We have to look, Rowan said, bracing himself. We can't leave anyone. They worked on the door's lock, but it wasn't as straightforward as the hatch outside. Multiple fail-safes resisted the hacking device's attempts. Finally, Rowan pried open a small access panel and used manual override procedures he'd learned years ago. The door slid open just enough for them to squeeze inside. What greeted them was a vision of living horror. The space resembled a morgue crossed with a high-tech abattoir. Racks of stasis chambers lined the walls, each containing a living being suspended in viscous fluid, some definitely human, others with unusual skin pigments, body structures, or alien features. Tiny red lights blinked on the control panels, indicating that the subjects were alive but kept in a near-death state. In the corner, Rowan spotted an entire cluster of smaller pods, each with neon displays that tracked neurological readings. At least two of them were occupied by individuals whose skin held the same emerald hue as Alice's. A trembling gasp escaped Alice, and tears welled in her golden eyes. "They're my people," she choked. She reached out a shaking hand to the nearest pod, pressed her palm against the cold glass. "I can feel their fear." Rowan's jaw tightened. "We're getting them out. All of them." It was a daunting prospect. There had to be dozens of stasis pods here alone, and likely more elsewhere. He started scanning the control panels. "I can't just smash the pods, or we'll risk killing them. We need to initiate a proper shutdown sequence for each unit." Ellis wiped at her eyes, trying to steady herself. "I'll do it. My abilities might help me guide them out of the sedation, but we need to hurry." They worked in tandem, Rowan bypassing security protocols on the consoles, while Elise used her empathic connection to soothe the half-conscious captives. One by one, stasis pods flickered off, releasing swirling fluid that gurgled into drainage. Some of the newly freed captives collapsed onto the cold floor, alive but barely coherent. Ellis knelt by them, offering the gentle warmth of her empathic presence, trying to quell their terror. More pods powered down as Rowan accessed a route command, shutting off entire rows. Then, from behind them, an alarm klaxon began to wail. The overhead lights shifted from pallid white to angry red. Footsteps thundered in the adjacent corridor. Their infiltration was discovered, and the labs were about to become a battleground. The wailing klaxon echoed ominously through the sterile hallways. Elise pressed trembling hands to the chest of a newly freed empath, a young man whose skin bore a dull emerald hue and whose eyes fluttered open, wild with confusion. She projected a wave of calm, just enough to keep him from panicking as he stumbled free of the stasis pod. Nearby, Rowan Drake crouched behind a console, pulse pistol in hand, scanning through the rising tide of swirling alarms. Their infiltration of the Vanguard Culinary Consortium's secret lab had lasted mere minutes before a facility-wide alert was triggered. "I count at least a dozen hostiles converging on our position," Rowan muttered, letting his neural augments paint a tactical overlay across his vision. His battered ribs protested each breath, reminding him they had been through one firefight too many already. "They've probably locked down every exit. We'll have to make one if we can't find a proper route out." Ellis helped the freed empath to a safer corner of the lab, then returned to Rowan's side. She felt the intense cocktail of emotions radiating through the facility: anger, fear, cruel anticipation. But beneath it all, there was something more disturbing: a ruthless determination that sparked like static along her empathic senses. "Someone powerful is here," she warned, her voice taut. "They want to keep us from leaving with any evidence, or anyone." Rowan wiped sweat from his brow, eyes flicking to the half-dozen stasis pods that still contained living captives. A lab console glowed near the piece, each status screen marked by the cryptic lines of code. "If we don't at least open these, we'll be leaving them to die," he said grimly. Ellis nodded, though her eyes held quiet alarm. "If I help you work the controls, I can guide them as they come out of sedation, but we have to do it fast." They both set to work, fingers dancing over the console interface. Elise cast empathic pulses into each pod, trying to coax the occupant's psyche gently to wakefulness. Beside her, Rowan navigated the labyrinth of lab protocols, deactivating the neural dampeners and chemical feeds. One pod hissed open, spilling a young woman with turquoise, scaly features onto the floor, her chest heaving. Another contained a Terran man with deep scars, gasping for air as the fluid drained. The overhead lights suddenly snapped from red to harsh white, and the klaxon silenced, replaced by a calm, synthesized voice. "Containment breach on sub-level Delta. Initiate sterilization protocols in T-10 minutes." Rowan's face went pale. "Sterilization protocols," he repeated. "They're going to purge the entire section." He glanced up at Elis. "That means lethal gas, or maybe an explosive measure. Either way, they'll wipe out everything and everyone down here." Panic flickered through the newly awakened captives. Their eyes darted to the exit, or to Ellis, or to Rowan. Elise projected a blanket of reassurance, though her own heart hammered. "Rowan," she whispered, The corridor we came through will be crawling with guards by now. Rowan lowered his voice, addressing the half-coherent group. Stay with us, and we'll find another path. We have to get past their final security checkpoint. Maybe force an exit to the city's lower transport tunnels. It's our only shot. That shot seemed slimmer by the second, but neither Rowan nor Ellis was willing to surrender. Rallying their ragtag group, they prepared to fight for every foot of ground between them and freedom. Getting out would require cunning and firepower. Leading the group of half-conscious fugitives, Rowan cautiously guided them along a back corridor where the overhead pipes tangled with cables as thick as a human arm. The clinical sterility that once characterized the lab was quickly replaced by an industrial gloom, with grated floors and flickering lights casting uncertain shadows. A distant hiss cut through the corridor, accompanied by a mechanical whir. Elise tensed, feeling the approach of multiple hostiles. "They're coming," she said, voice tight. "I sense about 8, no, 9, and someone else, someone with a colder, harsher presence, a stickboyo." Rowan tightened his grip on his pulse pistol. The real muscle, he guessed grimly, likely the head of security or someone high up. They found cover behind a row of heavy steel crates labeled biological hazard, authorized personnel only. The rescued captives grouped behind them, shifting anxiously. One of the turquoise-skinned women pressed a trembling hand to Elise's shoulder. "We can't go back in there," the woman whispered. "I won't let them take me again." "You're not going back," Elise reassured her, the empathic warmth in her voice comforting, despite the dire situation. "Stay low. Let us handle this." The team of mercenaries rounded the corner with swift precision, rifles scanning for targets. Their lead figure, a tall, sinewy man with a grim set to his features, paused only a moment before barking an order. "Weapons free. Contain them at all costs." Rowan popped out from behind a crate, taking 2 careful shots with the pistol. The first bolt struck a mercenary square in the chest, dropping him. The second went wide, but Elise darted forward, focusing all her empathic might into a targeted assault. The wave of pure terror she projected momentarily staggered 2 more mercenaries. They clutched their helmets, disoriented, giving Rowan a moment to press the advantage. However, the lead figure, clearly augmented, seemed unfazed by Elise's empathic surge. He stepped over his fallen squad mates and fired a sizzling volley of plasma at Rowan, forcing him back into cover. Another mercenary lobbed a stun grenade that went skittering across the grated floor, bouncing toward the huddled group of freed captives. "No," Elise cried. Her empathic senses flared again, desperation fueling a second wave. This time, she aimed specifically at the mercenary who had thrown the grenade, overloading his perception with waves of anguish. He flinched, doubling over in silent agony just before the grenade detonated. The blast was partially contained by a stray crate, but the shockwave still rippled through the corridor, leaving several of the freed captives on their knees, ears ringing. Rowan forced himself to remain calm, despite the ringing in his own ears. "We can't win a firefight like this," he growled, scanning the ceiling. "We need a diversion." Above them, a nest of steel cables and ducts looked precariously supported. With a quick aim at a structural joint, Rowan unleashed a burst of pulse fire. Sparks flew as the joint gave way, toppling a section of overhead piping onto the mercenaries. Metal crashed onto the corridor, pinning 2 more men under a twisted tangle. The lead operative dove clear, rolling expertly, but the rest of his squad was momentarily scattered. "That's our window," Rowan shouted, beckoning the group. "Move, now!" In a frantic surge, they darted past the wreckage, the sounds of alarms and snarled curses echoing in their wake. With the sterilization countdown ticking toward a catastrophic end, Rowan and Ellis pressed on, resolved to find a way out, or die trying. Deeper into the facility they went, the halls snaking through levels of research labs, locked containment rooms, and humming generator spaces. Alyssa's empathic senses danced with the swirling emotions of fear from the rescued captives and determination from Rowan, who led them forward with dogged focus. Her mind buzzed painfully, as though 1,000 voices screamed in a cacophony she couldn't quite quell. At last they reached a wide corridor sealed by a formidable blast door. A flashing sign overhead read, "Secure Research Wing." Authorized personnel only. The door's electronic interface glowed a dull red. Rowan knelt, rummaging in the kit Gia had given him. He produced a second hacking device, smaller than the first, but specialized for advanced locks. Elise pressed her back against the cold wall, trying to still her trembling. Adrenaline and empathic exertion had drained her. Yet she sensed an undercurrent of grim purpose from Rowan. He was pushing past injury and fatigue with pure resolve. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "What's in there?" she asked softly. Rowan exhaled. "Hopefully the data we came for, lab logs, shipping manifests, the entire operation exposed, and maybe more captive survivors. But if we open that door, we'll also set off every alarm they have left." She looked at the group of survivors, many leaning against the wall, some barely conscious. "We can't protect them all if a major security force hits us at once," Elise pointed out, desperation creeping into her tone. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, inhaling. "We split up," he said quietly. "Most of you take the corridor behind us. There's a supply elevator that might still function. I'll try to rig it to go straight to the upper loading docks. Elise and I will push in here, grab the data, and meet you on top." The rescued captives shared alarmed glances. A few still flinched at the idea of being separated from their protectors. But the logic was sound. One of the turquoise-skinned women, still pale and shaky, gently touched Elise's arm. "You saved us. We trust you," she whispered. Rowan managed a small, encouraging smile and stood. "Follow the corridor. Any guards left there should still be dealing with the flooding we caused earlier. Once you reach the supply elevator, override the safety mechanisms. If you meet trouble, keep your heads down until we find you." Elise nodded, stepping forward. "I'll help you," she said softly. "Then we'll come find the rest of you." With that, they parted ways. Rowan swiftly hacked the supply elevator's panel, jerry-rigging it to bypass standard lockdown protocols, then ushered the survivors onto it. The heavy doors clanged shut, and Ellis felt a last wave of fear and hope from them as they ascended. Turning back to the imposing blast door, Rowan attached the hacking device. It beeped, reading the advanced encryption. "This is definitely the nerve center," he muttered. "Give me a minute." Time was something they didn't have. The overhead voice repeated the sterilization countdown. "-5 minutes." That cold automation of life or death spurred them on. Ellis pressed a shaky palm to the door, focusing her mind. She sensed not just electronics, but presences behind that steel barrier. Guards, scientists, and something else sharper, more predatory. Finally, the hacking device chirped a single flat tone. The blast door slid open. Rowan raised his weapon, stepping inside. The facility's final secret lay beyond, along with whomever intended to keep them out or kill them. They emerged into a vast chamber lined with banks of gleaming servers, the overhead lights casting an unsettling glow. Monitors displayed a tangled web of data, streaming vital signs, shipping logs, and endless columns of numbers, each representing shipments of biological assets to elite clients across the system. It was, in essence, the nerve center of everything the Vanguard Culinary Consortium had built. But the first thing that seized Rowan's attention wasn't the machinery. In the center of the chamber, a raised platform held a row of advanced containment capsules. Behind the glass walls of each capsule, emerald-skinned individuals lay unconscious, their bodies connected to intravenous lines that pulsed with a pale blue fluid. Alice gasped, her empathic senses overwhelmed by the faint pulses of life. "How many more of my people are they holding?" she whispered, eyes brimming with horror. Across the room, a tall man in a crisp white suit stepped forward, flanked by 2 guards in tactical gear. His polished shoes clicked against the metal floor, exuding a calm aura that contrasted sharply with the alarm still echoing in the distance. A pin bearing the consortium's insignia gleamed on his lapel. "Welcome," he said, voice smooth as glass. "I wondered who would be audacious enough to breach our labs. Mr. Drake, I believe, and the empath who escaped her rightful purchase." Rowan leveled his pistol at the man's chest. "You're the one in charge," he spat. "You've been trafficking and butchering living beings." The man smiled without warmth. "I prefer to think of it as innovation. Humanity's culinary frontiers must advance, and empathic neurochemicals have limitless potential beyond mere gastronomy, medical, military, you name it. The universe is built on power, my friend. Some must be sacrificed for the many to prosper. Ellis's anger flared, and Rowan felt a tangible surge of her emotion. You murder entire species to fill your pockets, she snapped, voice trembling with fury. There is nothing noble about that. Call it what you will, the man gestured to the capsules. If you insist on moralizing, consider that we are on the brink of synthesizing empathic abilities. Imagine an entire arm capable of shaping emotional states, controlling riots, negotiating treaties, even neutralizing conflict. Humanity ascends thanks to the sacrifice of a few. Everyone wins. Rowan's eyes burned. You're insane. Outside, the overhead broadcast signaled, T-minus 3 minutes to sterilization. The cold voice reverberated through the chamber. The man's smirk only grew. Even if you kill me, you'll never save them all, nor will you stop what's already in motion. The upper echelons of New Shanghai, the powerful factions on Mars and Luna, they're all investors. Your expose, should you even manage to upload it, will be crushed. Rowan aimed at the control station near the containment capsules. Ellis, get to those pods, he said, advancing. I'll handle this. Two guards raised their rifles, tension crackling in the air. Ellis darted across the room, ignoring the lingering dizziness in her head. She reached a console with a half-dozen monitors tracking vital signs. Her fingers flew over the controls. If she could free the captive empaths, she'd undermine the man's entire scheme, and perhaps create an ally of unstoppable emotional power. But the minister, if that's who he was, calmly stepped forward as his guards closed in. He arched one brow at Rowan, his posture radiating certainty. Do you think you can save her again? He taunted. You don't even believe in redemption for yourself. Rowan's grip on the pistol tightened. Every nerve in his body urged him to fire. But the guards pressed in, their rifles humming with lethal charge, and the minister, self-assured in his pristine suit, seemed almost amused. You act like you have a choice here, the minister continued, but you'll soon discover that all roads lead to the same end. The question is whether you choose the route that spares the most lives. Don't listen to him, Ellis called from across the chamber, her voice laced with empathy and determination. She toggled a release protocol for the containment capsules, initiating a cycle that gradually purged the sedative fluid from within. The overhead readouts flickered, showing the life signs in each chamber coming closer to conscious wakefulness. He's just trying to sow doubt. But the minister seized upon her words with a smug smile. You think your empathic abilities can protect you from reality? This entire operation spans multiple worlds. Even if I die, my partners will keep the project going. Rowan wanted to retort, but the lead guard suddenly swung his weapon into firing position. Rowan reacted on pure instinct, diving behind a steel console as the guard unleashed a torrent of plasma shots. Sparks exploded across the mainframe, filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt circuitry. The second guard moved to flank Rowan, but Rowan's augmented reflexes gave him just enough edge. He managed a careful shot, taking the guard in the shoulder and sending him spinning against the wall. Ellis, hurry! Rowan shouted as he scrambled for cover. Return fire rained down, forcing him to duck behind a monitor bank. The sterilization countdown mocked them in the background. T-minus 2 minutes, the minister calmly surveyed the destruction, stepping out of the line of fire with an infuriating composure. He tapped a small device on his wrist, and overhead, a set of thick blast shutters began sliding down. The only visible exit was now being sealed. Rowan's heart lurched. If those shutters fully closed, they'd all be trapped, including the freed empaths. His mind raced. Gia had given him a final contingency, a disruptor charge that overloaded security systems. Fishing the small metallic sphere from his belt, he primed it with trembling fingers. One last guard stood between Rowan and the shutter control. Rowan sprang from cover, ignoring the searing pain in his side. The guard fired a single shot that grazed Rowan's arm, blistering the skin, but Rowan pushed forward. He tackled the man to the floor, wrestling the rifle aside, then slammed the disruptor charge onto the central control panel. A high-pitched whine emanated from the charge, quickly cresting into a shrieking pitch. The entire facility's electronics flickered. screens flashing nonsense code. In the far corner, Elise watched as the sedation tubes in the capsules sputtered, then stilled. The overhead shutters froze mid-descent. The minister, now stripped of his remote override, let out a curse under his breath. His cold veneer cracked for the first time. "You fool," he snarled, sweeping up a pistol from the fallen guard. "You'll kill us all!" Rowan, panting, forced himself back to his feet. "Better that than letting you walk out of here with your twisted research." Outside, the countdown had reached T-minus 60 seconds. They had less than a minute. Ellis rushed to the capsules, forcing the manual release latches. If the overhead systems were compromised, she'd have to free them by hand. One by one, the emerald-skinned captives stirred to life, confusion and terror playing across their faces. Elise channeled calm as best she could, guiding them upright, silently praying there was still time to escape. "Tick-tock," the minister said, glancing at a flickering status screen that displayed the final seconds of the sterilization protocol. He leveled his pistol at Rowan, eyes narrowed with cold intent. "Tell me, Mr. Drake, do you truly believe you can outrun the fate you've brought upon yourself?" Rowan stared down the barrel, breath ragged. Memories of his old life flashed. The hunts, the kills, the guilt that drove him to seek a hollow redemption in the city's upper levels. This man's questions stung like a living embodiment of his own darkest doubts. But then he saw Elise huddled beside the newly awakened empaths, her golden eyes brimming with defiance and compassion, even as the building threatened to annihilate them all. He knew the answer. He had found purpose again. "I'm not running anymore," Rowan said. He lunged to the side, firing a quick shot. The bolt tore across the minister's wrist, forcing him to drop the pistol with a pained crooning. The weapon clattered against the floor. Rowan kicked it away, not allowing any chance for the minister to recover it. Behind them, Elise guided the last freed empath from the capsule, offering her a supporting arm. "We have to go," Ellis shouted, voice trembling with urgency. "The entire level will be flooded with toxins or worse in seconds." Rowan grabbed the nearest console and hoisted himself upright, wincing at the burn on his arm. Through the swirl of alarms, he saw the partial schematics on a flickering monitor. One corridor led to an emergency shuttle bay. "This way," he yelled, gesturing to Ellis and the disoriented empaths. The minister snarled in pain, blood dripping from his wounded wrist. Despite the chaos, he jabbed a control on a side panel, causing a portion of the floor to split open. A small sub-platform rose, revealing a sleek personal transport craft perched like a waiting spider. He stumbled toward it, refusing to be denied an escape. Rowan leveled his pistol again. "You're not leaving with them," he warned. The minister's laugh turned bitter as he climbed onto the transport's open hatch. "They're not my concern anymore. But if you think you've won, you're even more naive than I thought. The consortium has resources across the entire solar network. This operation is just one branch. Your little rescue will change nothing." Ellis steadied one of the awakened empaths, catching the minister's malignant glare. She felt something vicious swirl in his mind, a last-ditch attempt at revenge. With a trembling hand, he keyed an override on the transport's console. "Enjoy your victory," he spat. "If you survive the next 30 seconds. The countdown boomed across the facility. 15 seconds to sterilization. Gas vents around the edges of the chamber hissed ominously. Rowan's gaze darted toward Ellis, and he saw the fear in her eyes. They couldn't hold their breath through whatever lethal agent was about to be unleashed, nor could the freed empaths. Summoning what remained of her strength, Elise projected a final empathic wave that disoriented the minister just long enough for Rowan to sprint forward and slam the transport hatch closed on his leg. The man howled, pulling free, and scrambled inside. With a roar of engines, the craft shot up, disappearing through a roof panel that parted for it. In seconds, he was gone. "Rowan!" Ellis screamed. "Time's out!" A metallic clang resounded as overhead ducts opened to release whatever toxins the system used for sterilization. Rowan grabbed Ellis's hand and motioned for the others to follow. With no time to think, they hurled themselves into the corridor leading to the emergency shuttle bay. The corridor itself was a hazard course of strobing emergency lights and spinning red sirens. The faint hiss of vented gas echoed from the labs behind them. Rowan's neural augments warned him of toxic particles saturating the air, even in these last few meters. Each labored breath sent a searing ache into his lungs. Ellis coughed, pressing an arm across her face, and the freed empath stumbled, wide-eyed with panic. Go, go, Rowan urged, half carrying one of the weaker captives. At the far end, a wide metal door marked Shuttle Bay 6 beckoned like a final lifeline. They lurched toward it, each step feeling like an eternity. The overhead voice proclaimed, "Sterilization active. All organic matter in sublevel Delta will be neutralized." Rowan rushed to the shuttle bay's control panel, jamming the palm-sized hacking device onto it. The device sputtered, still half-fried from the disruptor blast earlier. "Come on," he growled, slamming a fist against the panel. Sparks erupted, and the door grudgingly began to open, only to halt halfway, stuck on bent tracks. The freed empaths pressed themselves through the narrow gap one by one, faces contorted with coughing or grimaces of pain. Rowan and Illis were the last. He wedged his shoulder against the half-open door, forcing it just enough so that Elise could slide through. A swirl of acrid smoke leaked in from behind, stinging Rowan's eyes. "Rowan, hurry!" Elise coughed. Gritting his teeth, he sucked in a breath of burning air and ducked through the gap. The door ground shut behind him with a final squeal of metal. They stumbled into the shuttle bay, a hangar-like space dominated by a mid-sized transport craft. The overhead signage flickered, revealing docking clamps and fueling stations. Rowan guided everyone toward the transport ramp. It was locked, but the side console glowed with standard docking instructions. With a shaky hand, he keyed in a universal override. Thankfully, the transport recognized a default security code, perhaps a leftover from the ongoing chaos. The ramp descended, revealing a cramped interior designed for cargo runs and short-range flights. Ellis helped usher the group inside. She could still feel the oppressive sense of dread rolling off each empath. Though they were free, the threat of the toxins was still real. Row by row, they collapsed onto cargo crates or the floor, rasping for cleaner air. The overhead lights in the bay flickered as the facility's system began to degrade under its own extreme measures. Rowan secured the ramp and hurried to the cockpit. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat, scanning the console. "I haven't flown anything in years, but it's better than choking down poison," he muttered. He jammed the ignition switch. The engines rumbled uncertainly, then roared to life. A voice crackled over the bay's comm. "System. Unauthorized launch detected. Maintain position or be fired upon." Rowan ignored it. He toggled thrusters to maximum, the vessel rattling under the strain. Outside, the hangar bay's roof was sealed. He slammed a second set of controls to open the overhead hatch, only to find the mechanism unresponsive. "Blast," he swore. The systems locked it down to contain the sterilization. Elise appeared behind him, leaning over the pilot's seat. "Wait!" She spotted a small auxiliary panel with an emergency release. Her empathic abilities flared again, sensing the system's electronic signals like faint emotional impulses. "There's a backup switch, right here." She keyed it, and a rumble vibrated through the bay as external clamps disengaged. Overhead, the segmented roof began to part, revealing a rectangle of star-flecked night sky. Rowan seized the chance. He yanked the control stick back and the transport lurched upward, banging against half-open panels. Metal shrieked. The engines whined, but the craft burst through, emerging into open air. Below them, the facility's underground structure rumbled ominously. A plume of rancid vapor escaped from the parted roof. They had escaped the toxins. Barely. Rowan banked the transport, heart hammering with relief, as Ellis let out a shaky breath. They were free, for now. But the real battle, exposing the consortium, was only just beginning. The next 48 hours felt like a sprint through chaos. Rowan managed to pilot the stolen transport to a disused corner of New Shanghai's sprawling outskirts. Under the radar, they touched down in an abandoned cargo port where they rendezvoused, miraculously, with Gia, who bore fresh scars from a firefight of her own. With her help, they slipped the freed empaths to a secure location in the Undercity, beyond the grasp of local authorities for the moment. In the meantime, Gia took charge of uploading every shred of data Rowan and Ellis had salvaged, broadcasting it across multiple off-world channels. The revelations ignited a system-wide scandal. The Vanguard Culinary Consortium, once famed for supplying the galaxy's elite restaurants, was revealed as a monstrous operation trafficking sentient beings for profit. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. Even some corporations pretended ignorance. But enough tangible evidence existed to lead to high-profile arrests. Amid the political firestorm, the minister who fled by personal transport remained at large. Rumors placed him skulking in the shadows of a private orbital station, or possibly off-planet entirely. Gia warned them that a cornered enemy was often the most dangerous. She and Rowan took turns coordinating security and screening infiltration threats, all while Elise guided her freed kin through the trauma of captivity. At last, a tenuous calm settled. In the labyrinth of the Undercity, they established a makeshift refuge, a hidden warren of sealed chambers that Gia once used to store contraband. There, Elise's people rested, regaining their strength. Their empathic connection wove a tapestry of mutual support, each assisting the others in healing from the mental and physical wounds inflicted by the consortium. Rowan observed them, seeing something he'd rarely encountered, a community bound by compassion, despite everything. During a lull in the tension, Rowan found Ellis standing near the edge of a half-finished balcony overlooking the neon sprawl of lower New Shanghai. A faint hum of generators underscored the flicker of faulty LED strips. "How are they?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside her. She turned, her emerald skin catching the dim glow from below. "They're recovering slowly, but they've all lost family, friends. Our species is scattered across the stars, hunted for the sake of these twisted experiments. We can't stay here forever." Rowan nodded. "We have options. Gia has contacts on Mars or in the outer colonies. I might be able to buy safe passage for you and the others." Ellis studied him, her golden eyes reflecting a sadness that ran far deeper than the present moment. "What about you? Are you going to stay in New Shanghai?" He sighed, staring at the flickering lights. He'd spent half a decade trying to bury his past beneath wealth and distance, only to realize that he couldn't escape who he truly was. "I can't stay either. Even if the authorities clear me, there's nothing left here except ghosts. And honestly, I can't turn my back on what we started. There are still more out there, more labs, more trapped innocents." She placed a gentle hand on his. He felt a subtle wave of emotion that mixed her gratitude, affection, and lingering sorrow. "We'll do it together then. You, me, Gia, and anyone willing to fight. If that means building a new life somewhere else, so be it." In the hazy neon glow, Rowan leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers, a silent promise passing between them. The hush of the city felt momentarily distant. Their bond, forged in terror and trial, had given them both a renewed sense of purpose. Behind them, Gia coughed awkwardly, arms folded. "I hate to interrupt," she said dryly, "but you've got visitors." It was a year later. The wind across the Martian plains kicked up a pinkish dust, swirling around the terraforming domes of the fledgling settlement. Once a forgotten outpost, now it served as a home for those seeking to rebuild their lives far from the maddening corruption of New Shanghai. A series of tall, transparent domes dotted the landscape, each housing a small ecosystem of cultivated crops, living quarters, and rudimentary communal spaces. In the largest dome, Rowan Drake checked the pressure seals on a newly installed irrigation system. His newly upgraded cybernetics, courtesy of Gia's resourceful engineering, allowed him to handle heavier machinery. Each day brought a new challenge in terraforming, but somehow these tasks felt oddly more fulfilling than any high-rise penthouse life he'd once known. "Rowan!" Ellis's voice called from near the greenhouse. She appeared with a delighted grin on her face, waving him over. "You have to see this." He set down his tools and ambled over, noticing several other empaths gathered around a small cluster of seedlings whose leaves gleamed in vibrant green beneath the UV lamps. The transplanted soil from Earth and the local Martian substrate fused to create a hardy new variety of plant, one Elise and her people had been carefully cultivating for its nutritional and therapeutic properties. "These buds will be our first harvest," Ellis beamed, excitement shining in her golden eyes. "We can feed everyone in the dome and still have enough to share with Gia's settlement 2 clicks away." Rowan couldn't help but grin. "You've become quite the botanist." She shrugged playfully, her hand slipping into his. "We have to survive somehow, right? growing instead of running. Her smile held a warmth that echoed through Rowan's chest. A familiar voice rang out behind them. Speaking of running, you guys are behind schedule for the supply drop. Gia emerged from a newly constructed storage unit wearing her ever-present utility vest and a scowl that softened only slightly at the sight of her friends. Transport's leaving in an hour. Rowan snorted. Can't you ever just say hello like a normal person? Where's the fun in that? Gia shot back, rolling her cybernetic eye. But she was smiling. They all were because despite the uncertain future, this moment felt like a triumph. Their efforts over the last year had reached far beyond a single lab. The data Gia distributed shook the foundations of the consortium, exposing powerful players and forcing massive reforms. Though certain factions tried to rebuild the operation in secret, Rowan, Ellis, and Gia worked relentlessly to track down any trace of it. Day by day, fewer hidden labs remained operational. More captives were freed. From behind a row of oxygen-producing algae tanks, a small cat darted out, mewling insistently. Ellis bent to scoop it into her arms, rolling her eyes with mock exasperation. Another one found us, she said, pressing her cheek to the cat's soft fur. Rowan chuckled. I guess word's out that we adopt strays. Gia grinned wryly. Strays, misfits, broken ex-bounty hunters, entire empathic communities. Yeah, we've made quite a home here. And indeed they had. A home shaped by survival, compassion, and the refusal to accept a world where living, sentient beings were treated as commodities. Glancing out at the Martian horizon, the red sky fading into a dusk of purplish clouds, Rowan felt something he had thought forever lost. A sense of peace. Alyssa's fingers slipped through his. He felt her empathic presence, a gentle nudge that said, "We made it. We're alive. And we're together." He closed his eyes briefly, letting that simple truth settle in his chest. We've come a long way from that night in the Grand Horizon, he murmured. She squeezed his hand, and there's still so much to do. Together they turned toward the settlement's softly glowing lights, the sound of voices mingling with the distant hum of terraforming equipment, a testament to hope rising from ashes. And in that quiet, dust-swirled air, Rowan Drake realized that no five-star restaurant or gilded skyscraper could ever match the richness found in a small, hard-won community, thriving on a frontier where every day was a testament to resilience and love. Looking back on this journey, it's clear that hope can flourish in the darkest places. Rowan's transition from solitary bounty hunter to selfless protector, and Ellis's triumph over unimaginable cruelty remind us that compassion and unity can overcome even the most entrenched injustice. The rescued empaths now have a future where they can heal and rebuild, standing as a testament to the bravery, sacrifice, and loyalty they all shared. For me personally, this story emphasizes the power of empathy and the courage it takes to challenge corrupt systems. Even when it seems like the entire universe is against you, perseverance and love can chart a path to a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for accompanying us on this thrilling ride. Your engagement and feedback mean everything. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment and share your ideas about the story's twists, the characters' growth, and what you think awaits them next. Let's keep the conversation going.